We need to emphasize or bring back the definition of climate justice to the sole cause of climate injustice, which is the dispossession of lands from Indigenous communities.
Mutual, mutual, la mutual, mutual, la. This is the Mutual Broadcasting System.
What we are witnessing is the exposure of lies, that colonization is neither benevolent or non-violent.
To understand the resistance would be to understand settler-colonialism, for which mainstream media is intimately entwined with the state in this country.
Everything we do here, everything we do is really counts.
Our liberation will never be found in states, in governments, in courts, but it will be found in each other.
You're listening to the Justice for Palestine podcast.
This podcast is produced on the unceded lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people by the Radio Reversal Collective.
In this podcast, we're aiming to create a living archive of the movement for Palestinian liberation in this city and the work that organisers, activists, artists, academics, workers, parents and everyday people are doing to challenge the genocidal project of the Israeli government.
In this episode, we're picking up where we left off, thinking about the global systems that are shaping resistance movements unfolding around the world.
In particular, we're focusing on land back and the importance of understanding Palestine as a climate justice struggle.
In this episode, you'll hear excerpts featuring a speech by Auntie Linda Fairbanks at a March for Palestine held on the so-called Gold Coast in January of 2024, an interview with Auntie Tracy Hanshaw at the Rising Tide Blockade in late 2023, an interview with Guy Rathani from the Pacific Climate Warriors, reflections from Dr. Jamal Nabulsi, and you'll also hear Anna and Malak in conversation, drawing some of these threads together to help us interrogate the relationship between climate change and racial colonial capitalism, to connect the struggle for a free Palestine with the struggle for climate justice, and the struggle for justice for all First Nations people everywhere, and to help us better understand why land back is climate justice and why there is no climate justice without justice for the dispossessed.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and I guess your relationship to the Justice for Palestine struggle?
So I'm Palestinian in diaspora. My grandfather's from a town called Barbara, which was destroyed in 1948. My grandmother's from a town called Silwan, which is in Jerusalem. And so my whole life in diaspora, I've had a deep connection to Palestine, even though I've only visited the country once. I was taught our customs and how to cook our foods and our dabka and our henna and everything. So now that I'm an adult, I've started taking part in protests and being part of Justice for Palestine and trying to do my part as a Palestinian diaspora to bring knowledge onto my communities and just my people in general in our struggle.
We're kind of trying to draw out some of the links between the movements for climate justice that have been building globally and the struggle for Palestine, and really strongly understand how these struggles are connected, but also the kind of frustration that climate justice movements aren't necessarily always engaging directly with the Free Palestine movement. So tell us about your relationship to climate justice work. Like, what brings you into that kind of thinking?
Well, as a kid, I would go to my grandfather's farm every year and I would work with him and we'd cultivate on the land. He'd teach me about, he would grab the soil and he would feel it and he would say, okay, this, because we're in a drought right now, the soil's dry, so these are the plants we're going to use to help give nutrients into the soil. And then from there, I just loved the environment, so I studied environmental science in high school, and now I'm doing a degree in environmental science as well, and have but participated in the school strike for climate change and all of that. That was exciting. But yeah, my connection to climate justice is probably one that was created from my grandfather's sorrow in missing his land and how he tried to connect to any other land he could find. And so I kind of realised how important land cultivation was to people, and so I just tried to help restore the land, I guess, in my studies.
So it's a perfect and very poignant introduction to the kind of conversation we're having today, right, which is about what it means if your orientation to climate justice comes from ancestral Indigenous relationships to land, and the way that gives us a clear sense of the struggle for a free Palestine as a climate justice struggle.
Yeah, it was a bit upsetting with the amount of peers in my degree who didn't say anything when I was a bit shocked, because as environmental science students we learn about how Indigenous communities cultivated on the land. They use permaculture and all types of different farming systems, and how that worked for them, and how they have such a deep connection, and where we as environmental scientists and environmental students are trying to mitigate the climate crisis, and yet there was this disconnect between a connection with the land and mitigation of climate crisis, which I found a bit confronting.
Yeah, and I think, again, this really speaks to the the absence of, or the ways that kind of, I guess, non-Indigenous-led climate movements and environmental movements have often overlooked the kind of they've overlooked the origins even of the climate crisis in precisely colonization, white supremacy, European imperialism, racial capitalism, all of these dynamics. And I think this is kind of the place we wanted to talk about in relation to climate justice movements, right? Is that colonization is always climate injustice. It is a project of making Indigenous lands uninhabitable for the peoples who belong to them.
Jingari Jimbalungs, Anyanari Linda Bumaiwai, belonging to the Manajali people of the Yugambeh language region. You are all gathered on Yugambeh Jagun today. I am a direct descendant of Bilin and Nellie, and I live, work and operate on country here. And I'm so proud that I'm connected here and responsible for this country that you're all gathered upon. It's a responsibility that all traditional custodians have. And in that responsibility, what we want is connection, peace, and love. And that everyone on this country and every country around the world look out for each other and take care of each other and love each other and learn from each other. I know that today in particular we're here to honour our Jarjams, our children, through the flying of the kites. And our Jarjams are our future. And while we think our Jarjams are so innocent as they are, we can also learn so much from them. We start realising that we can learn from every single person equally as much as our Jarjams, then we're going to be so much stronger. Because when we have a true connection and a true responsibility to each other, then that's all you need to be able to make sure that we're stronger and have more love together. So thank you. Welcome to this country here. I pay respects to my custodians who have passed, that they gave the ultimate sacrifice for us to still be here, for us to live how we live, but also for us to progress and for us to learn, adapt and be stronger for all the right reasons. Welcome. I hope you all stay safe. May we leave this place better than we found it. Thank you.
we wanted to start with a little part of an interview that I recorded with Aunty Tracy Hanshaw a couple of weeks ago at the Rising Tide blockade down in Mullumbimba, so-called Newcastle. That coal port is the biggest coal port in the world, and activists blockaded the port for just over 30 hours as part of a kind of growing movement to name the ways that the extraction of particularly extraction and export of coal is directly causing the kinds of climate injustice that we're seeing shape the world at the moment. So Aunty Tracy was one of the Awabakal and Goigal elders who was down there supporting the blockade, and she talked to me a little bit about some of the linkages that she sees between the struggle for climate justice and decolonisation globally, and particularly the solidarities that she and her community feel with Palestinians at the moment. So we're here on Wabakal land, and I'm catching up with Aunty Tracy Hanshaw, who's one of the spokespeople for this place in this country. Aunty Tracy, tell me what we're doing here.
Okay, so I'm Tracy Hanshaw and I'm from Justice Aunties here in Mullumbimba on a Wabakal land in Newcastle. And we're here at the Rising Tide event because this is the largest coal port in Australia here in Newcastle. And the amazing Rising Tide crew and their mobs have staged one of the largest coal blockades ever in this country and ever here in Newcastle. So we're here in support of them today and working together to help protect the land and this country's future.
So I was lucky enough to just be sitting here in a conversation with you that was kind of drawing some connections between the organising that's happening here in opposition to the continued expansion of the coal industry in so-called Australia, but connecting that to the struggles for climate justice globally led by Indigenous peoples everywhere. Do you want to talk a little bit about the kind of connections you see between climate justice on this continent and everywhere else?
So I've just returned from an environmental and sustainability conference in Sulawesi, and while I was there, I met with the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Fisheries, the university, and we were examining the effects of the land post-tsunami, which, when you think about it, tsunami is a big wave that comes in and impedes on the land. Well, when climate change is not looked after, monitored and brought under control, and the sea levels are rising and impeding onto land, that land becomes contaminated from seawater. So we really, and once that land's contaminated, it's useless. You can't farm, you can't grow food, you can't get fresh water. There's very little you can do. And I saw that firsthand for myself in Sulawesi, and I've seen what happens once the land's contaminated by seawater, and we can't allow that to happen here. So stopping coal and the fossil fuel emissions that come from coal burning and things like that are causing the climate change, and that's what we have to control and minimise. And that's why protests like this are very important. But it's not just in Australia, it's around the world. First Nations peoples around the world are fighting this fight, the environmental sustainability fight. And you know, when you think about invasion and colonisation, it's all about the land grab, control and making money out of the land. That's what colonisation is, at the expense of everybody that lives on that land. So for 235 years in Australia, they've been doing it. For 75 years in Israel, they've been doing it. That's what Gaza's all about now. That's why our Palestinian brothers and sisters are suffering and being murdered right now in the form of a genocide. They're 75 years into that war. It didn't start on October 7th, just like we're 235 years into that war on the Indigenous in Australia. So there's a camaraderie amongst Indigenous around the world, and that's why we have that unique bond with these people. Even though we don't know them, we know their struggle, we know their fight, and that's why Aboriginal people, First Nations peoples in Australia connect and support wholeheartedly the people in Palestine. You know, I know one of my elders recently came out and said there's no similarities, everything is similar. There is a huge similarity, and that's why First Nations peoples around Australia, here in Newcastle, in Brisbane, every aspect of this country, in Sydney, every capital city is rallying to support the people of Gaza, the Palestinians, the natives, First Nations of that country. We understand their fight, the genocide of them, and the useless, senseless killing all over land.
Absolutely, and I think that those threads are particularly clear given that we're here contesting further expansions of the coal industry in so-called Australia. We know that since October 7, at least 7 new extractive mining licences have been issued over Gaza by the Israeli authorities. So there are very clear explanations that come from the kind of the use of this form of extreme racial violence as a tool of a land grab. Yeah. One of the points you made in the discussion we were having before was about the essential centering of land back as the foundation of climate justice. Yep. For folks who haven't made that connection yet, can you talk it through?
I'll do my best. Look, everybody knows that the Indigenous of this country looked after this land for 65,000 years. How on God's green earth, and that's Australia, in 235 years can the government fuck that up? They've raped and pillaged the land, not the country. I'm talking about the land they take it from. It's destroying the land. Not only does fossil fuel burn and damage the ozone layer and the climate outside, but the damage they're doing to the land under the ground by mining this is what's dangerous. They are getting close to titanic plates that shift and move. That coal has formed the fortress of those plates. We have artesian water underneath the ground that gives it enough softness to move. This is creation, this is how it was meant to be. You start pulling coal out of that ground and weakening that ground around it. We're getting screwed from the bottom of the centre of the earth to above it, and it's got to stop. The reason that 7 coal licences have been issued, like in Gaza from Israel, again, it's about the land grab. Just like it's been done in Australia, and especially here in Newcastle. My mobs were documented back in the 1800s of being the only Aboriginal mob in Australia to talk about coal in their dream time and how dangerous it was, and that's why they embedded it back into the earth so that it wasn't outside burning the earth, because they knew tens of thousands of years ago, before scientists, that my mobs knew that coal was dangerous. Just like in the Northern Territory, their mobs talk about uranium stories in their dream time. My mob down here were the first to ever in Australia be known, and the only known mob with their Dreamtime stories talking about coal. So when all governments, whenever they take over Indigenous lands and First Nations people's lands, it's always about the land grab. It's always about how they can make money, how the government, and those governments are British settlements. In 1945, the English government gave the Jewish, after World War II, Palestine to live in, despite the fact that there was Palestinians still living there because the country was colonised. Ding, ding, that sounds like Australia. So the only way you can take forcibly land from people is to kill them and take them. And that's what we're seeing happening in Gaza right now.
I think the first thing I noticed what she said was land contamination. I don't think people know that soil and land are not sustainable resources. It takes 500 to 1,000 years for soil systems to replenish the nutrients that they need to have proper farming on the land. So any kind of contamination, whether that's from sea level rises or bombing or white phosphorus, that has completely contaminated the earth, not only so that you can't cultivate on the land, but so that the minerals that are now inside the land are going to make people ill. Yep. And that's what I think is the evilest part about colonization. It's the silent genocide part.
Yep.
Where they ruin your processes of cultivation to the extent that it'll make you sick, and either you die of starvation or you die of mineral contamination.
Yeah, toxicity, right? Yeah. And this is, I think, again, these are long-standing patterns, and I think this is part of what led, what listeners might have heard us talk about this before, but led black environmental or black-led environment movements in the US to coin the term environmental violence as a way to describe the specific ways that colonisation and white supremacy converge to create actively toxic environments for particularly communities of colour and Indigenous communities. But I think the point you make about this being the kind of silent side of these genocidal projects is really important, right?
Yeah, because I remember when we learnt about the Native Americans or what happened in Australia, and the way my history teacher framed it was, we only killed about this many people. The rest died from disease or lack of food. They didn't die. There was a reason that happened.
Yeah.
And even though it wasn't an active, through some sort of physical violence, it's still, in my eyes, and I think many people's eyes, murder.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it still counts as genocide. Like, you can't, especially with, I forgot what animal it was. With the Native Americans, they killed all of their animals.
The
buffaloes, yeah. And then when we learnt about it, my teacher just said, they just died of starvation because hunting the animals was something that people did. But why did they do that? There's a reason they did that, because they knew that starvation would work. And so that's still active genocide, but it's just hush-hush.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is kind of why we wanted to draw these conversations about the Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza at the moment, together with this much longer history of trying to, or of actively what's sometimes termed ethnically cleansing, so trying to dispossess Palestinians from their land, a process that has obviously happened both through overt Israeli violence, but also through making the land untenable, making it impossible for people to sustain their lives on that land.
My grandmother's family in Silwan in Jerusalem, we used to have we had the most beautiful block of land. I'm so lucky I got to see it before it got stolen from us. It was right on top of the hill, and you can see the dome of the rock and like the sun gleaming on the gold. It's gorgeous. But we had olive fields and sage, and my auntie used to say that the settlers would come and rip out the sage because they know that sage tea has health benefits. If you have a migraine or a stomachache, you drink sage tea. So they would come and they would rip out the sage, or they would burn the olive trees.
You know, I've been lucky enough, like one of really the only person in my close family who's been able to go back to Palestine since my grandfather's generation were ethnically cleansed from there, which is a huge privilege that owes basically to the fact that I have an Australian passport, and also have just got lucky at the border and, through interrogation have managed to kind of sneak my way through. And, I've been lucky enough to go and learn about the plants in particular. Like, I remember going on a hike and learning about how to pick the wild asparagus, halioun, and tasting that. And then a couple of weeks later, on my last day in Palestine, my friend sent me out to this vista, and it's on the total other side of Palestine, and it's across a Israeli-imposed border. And, just as I was leaving, I noticed a tiny sprig of the wild asparagus, in defiance of this border, and picked it and ate it, and that taste stayed with me as I crossed back over, not knowing if I would be able to go back again.
When we're thinking about the fact that the Israeli state is right now at the United Nations Climate Change Conference talking about the mechanisms through which they're going to, create a just transition and out of fossil fuel reliance. At precisely the same moment as we know that, and I know this from you, Malak, that the genocidal siege in Gaza has also been, at least in part, about opening up further space for mineral exploitation and particularly what I think is sometimes referred to as Gaza Marine. There was a great piece in Overland this week by Alex Kelly, and he talks about, he writes, Gaza Marine is a gas reserve of an estimated trillion cubic feet, 36 kilometres offshore from the Gaza Strip. In June this year, Israel gave preliminary approval for its development. And Kelly writes, in a chilling example of disaster capitalism, amidst uncertainty about how long the bombings will continue, both President Biden's energy security advisor, Amos Hochstein, and the energy news site Oil Price are speculating on how these gas reserves could help Gaza's recovery, which is pretty horrifying. But there's kind of even deeper convergences because some of the infrastructure associated with the exploitation of Gaza Marine is under the control of Adani, the very same Adani that is creating destructive mining licenses across the Galilee Basin. And they are responsible for the port infrastructure and have built so-called security plans and carceral apparatus into their budgets for this port infrastructure on the basis of the, quote, volatility of the region. So this kind of horrifying convergence, right, of climate, actively fueling the climate crisis, expanding gas and mineral exploitation in Gaza through this brutal, horrific regime of the siege.
It's interesting. I think once people look at the system and then they realize that every single system is in turn goes back to how you can make the most money and look good doing it, it's a bit shocking for people who've kind of looked at it always with both eyes closed. But at least it's coming to light that Gaza has oil and that Israel wants the oil, and the reason, part of the reason they're doing this bombing campaign is so that they can extract the oil, and that is the opposite of what they're saying at this summit. So it discloses some of their hypocrisy, but I think the most important thing about this is that it's getting people who have never thought about Palestine in their entire lives to start thinking about the fact that, okay, if you're killing this many people just for oil, then you're not only greedy, but there's something else there. And it's good because the people who the system is made for are starting to stand up for the people who the system continues to dehumanize and exploit.
Guy, I got to meet you very briefly at the Rising Tide blockade, but for listeners who haven't come across your work before, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and I guess your relationship to the climate justice movement?
Yeah, thank you, Anna. So I am a proud Pacific climate warrior. I come from Ngāti Toa Rangatira, Ngāti Kahungunu, and Ngāti Koata. Those are my tribes from Aotearoa or New Zealand. So it's the bottom tip of North Island, the top tip of the South Island. I've been doing climate advocacy with the Pacific Climate Warriors for about 4 going on 5 years now, and have been engaged in landscape care for waters, oceans, landscapes and skies my whole life. So I've been privileged to be involved in a number of different campaigns and organising across Australia, across the Pacific and across New Zealand, getting to know our communities, frontline impacts and the work needed to happen for us to fight for a climate just future, hopefully coming soon.
Been talking, I guess, about the importance of understanding colonisation and white supremacy as causes of environmental injustice, not just in Gaza, but specifically in this moment in Palestine, but also across the world. How do you see those relationships between colonisation, racism, and environmental violence taking shape in the Pacific?
Yeah, juicy question. Thank you, Anna. And it's right to the core of it. So I'm glad you're having this conversation. I mean, brief history lesson. I'll just pop a few important things in there. Firstly, being the doctrine of discovery, which was predates even terra nullius in Australia, which is essentially how colonization was made legal. by the colonizing forces, which was essentially any land that wasn't Christian-owned, was able to be taken by Christian colonizers or people creating new colonies. That followed up by a decree called the Great Chain of Being, both of which these you can look up. But essentially, the Great Chain of Being, I think, is one of the most important framings to understand when we talk about the connection between colonization and climate change. Now, the Great Chain of Being essentially outlines your divinity in relation to the world around us. So humans sit somewhere on the scale below gods and angels and above animals and flora and fauna. And so this inherent framing that underpins so much of power, narrative, storytelling, understanding humanity through colonization underpins our relationship to the landscape and says essentially we are better than animals, we are better than our landscape, we are better than our skies and our waters. And in fact, we are our skies and waters. We are made up of these beautiful exchanges by trees and oxygen and all of the stardust that has accumulated over time immemorial to become this fantastic thing we call the biosphere that we live upon, all the diversity of our landscape. And so taking a decolonial lens is really important when we're talking about climate change, because this narrative that we are better than our landscape, that we need to survive, is baked into every single colonial power structure and the fabric of our everyday life. So when we take a decolonial narrative to how some of our organizations work, to the way the economy works, and sometimes the way our language works, we can recognize that baked into that is this really problematic narrative that we shouldn't take care of our landscape. And it's a bit insidious when we unpack it. So how that emerges systemically is a huge confusion about the value and right of the ocean, the sanctity and health of the blue corridors that our whales travel through that take nutrients and vital minerals all around the world. For example, the salmon runs in North America, the great North American forests, the lungs of that whole region, there are very little nitrogen fixes in the soil there. And where that nitrogen actually comes from is the great salmon runs that bring nitrogen out from the deep ocean all the way up the rivers. And then they die and their bodies decay, and through insects and animals and the great beautiful web of life, this gets deposited back in the soil. So I'm getting quite nebulous on this, but there's a hugely interconnected narrative to how we understand ourselves and the world around us. And when we look more at the colonial structures that separate us from that reality, we can start to recognize how we've structurally made it difficult to advocate for the well-being and rights of our landscape. And that's what we see happening with the fossil fuel extraction, with mining, with the management of our waterways. That continues to exacerbate conditions for First Nations people all around the world, or the Palestinians at the moment, whose land is under siege for a variety of reasons, but also for the fact that there are very valuable fossil fuel resources underneath their land and their seas as well.
Part of the reason I was really excited to speak with you for this show is because I think that what you're describing as the kind of nebulous web of connections that crisscross the globe and draw together these ecosystems that make the kind of borders of colonies absurd. Those also speak to the kind of growing webs of solidarity, particularly solidarities led by Indigenous peoples globally. And I think this is something I've heard you speak about before. But can you talk a little bit about, I guess, the way you're seeing these kind of these solidarities forming maybe alongside those kind of much longer standing webs of connection that span the globe?
Hugely. Thank you. Great question again. As Indigenous people, it's important for us to recognize the sovereignty of landscape, not just where we are, but everywhere in the world. And what's happening right now in Gaza to the Palestinian people and their land is essentially what happened in Australia. It's what happened in North America. It's what happened in Aotearoa. It's what happened in the majority lands of Indigenous people. And we're watching this unfold before our eyes. Now, a lot of our communities have spent a lot of time, face to face, living with the real lived experience of these systemic issues that were created many, many years ago, and we have to continue doing that intergenerational work of unpacking this, system of harm. And that's exactly what we're seeing happen right now in Gaza. And so I'm not surprised to see First Nations and Indigenous communities across the world getting out in their entire cultural garments and with, all of their mob coming along to fight for the rights of Palestinian people, because essentially, if the world was to acknowledge the right of occupation or move against the right of occupation that's happening right now in Gaza, they have to acknowledge that reality everywhere else. And so we're at a pivotal time in the world right now for Indigenous people across the world. If we can push to get Australia to acknowledge the sovereignty of Palestinians, then they have to go through that same process here. And, I think about, the harm and hurt of the referendum in Gaza, all of this happening at the same time. But I think perhaps, will this be what it takes to get us through? Can we push to acknowledge that sovereignty both in Palestine right now for all of the people who are tragically losing their lives and families and bloodlines and landscapes? But can we use this great tragedy to push for transformation that we know we need?
Climate justice for me is just returning home, like being able to return home. And the land and the plants and the trees, they remember as well. In Palestine, like we call in Arabic, the prickly pear, it's called sabr. And this word, it means prickly pear, also means patience. And what Palestinians would do, rural Palestinians, is mark out plots of land for farming with prickly pear, like it would form a kind of fence. And in a lot of places, a lot of villages that were ethnically cleansed by Zionist forces in 1948, there's still, and you can go to these villages and there's still remains, there's still the stones, you can see the outlines of the houses, Israel covers over them, and part of the way that they do that actually is greenwashing. They build national parks, and they disguise their colonization under the pretense of caring for the earth, which is obviously something that happens here as well. But as hard as they've tried to uproot the sabr, it's a really, really stubborn plant as well, and it just keeps growing back and growing back. So in a lot of these ethnically cleansed villages, decades on, it's still, you can still see it marking out the land. So it stays there in its patience to mark out the land as Palestinian.
I think the greatest takeaway from all of this is how amazingly beautiful and resilient all Indigenous peoples are. Like, it's been 75 years for us Palestinians, and we haven't stopped. It's been almost 300 years for the Indigenous people of Australia, and they haven't stopped fighting, and we're not going to stop. Like, it's just quite beautiful how resilient we can be when we're, especially now that we're unified.
So, given all the conversations that we've heard already in this episode, why do you think it's important to centre land and climate justice in our understanding and organising around Palestine?
As we already know, land is extremely important to Indigenous communities and cultures because Indigenous people have learnt irrigation practices on the land, they've learned agricultural practices, they've learnt how to understand what seasons, what fruits to plant depending on the seasons. And so, of course, from that, you understand the climate and you understand the geology, you understand the soil systems of the lands you're working and cultivating on. So, my understanding of climate justice is that we need to restore the soil systems and the land back to how they were. And when they were okay, it was when they were in the hands of Indigenous communities. So you can't be a climate justice activist without understanding that Indigenous agricultural practices are the way to restore soil systems, and that the understanding between human and earth, which is extremely spiritual and in-depth in Indigenous cultures, is something that we need to center in climate activism. And so the correlation between the two is just like, it's positive. It's a 0.9% correlation. It's
the same struggle.
Yeah, and we need to emphasize or bring back the definition of climate justice to the sole cause of climate injustice, which is the dispossession of lands from Indigenous communities. You've been listening to the Justice for Palestine Magangin podcast,
produced by the Radio Reversal Collective.
Huge thanks to 4ZZZ here in so-called Brisbane for providing the space and resources for us to pull together this series.
If you're interested in amplifying the struggle for justice for Palestine through your own platforms and you'd like to access the Justice for Palestine Magangin audio archive, please let us know via our Substack, where you'll also find details about how to get involved in the struggle for Palestinian liberation right here in Magangin.